Welcome to lesson number 16. Today's lesson is called Sinners Under the Sentence of Death. Today's question is, why do we all need Christ's redemption? Imagine that a man is condemned to death by a court. The judge's sentence states that the man's hands and feet will be shackled, his eyes blindfolded, and he will be taken by helicopter to the middle of the Sahara Desert. There he will be dropped off without food or water, hundreds of unknown miles from safety. There is no chance that the man could save himself from the consequences of his sin. Our sins place us under a sentence from which we are unable to free ourselves. Today's church words are original sin. Original sin is the sin that we inherit from our parents. It's almost like a disease, it just gets passed on. From the time we're conceived, we have original sin. The next church word is actual sin, which means the sins that we are daily committing. And our last church word is redeem, which means to buy back. Jesus bought us back with his blood. Genesis 1 verse 27 says, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them." What does it mean to be created in the image of God? It means that man and women were created perfectly. They were holy, just as God is holy. And they knew God's will and were able to agree perfectly with his will. Later on in Genesis, we hear the account of the fall into sin. When Adam and Eve were tempted by Satan, ate of the fruit, and lost the image of God. Romans chapter 5 verse 18 tells us that we all suffer from the consequence of Adam's sin. Romans chapter 5 verse 18 says, "Consequently, just as one trespass resulted in condemnation for all people, so also one righteous act resulted in justification and life for all people." The guilt of Adam's sin has passed all of us. We are all guilty of sin and are condemned to death because of Adam's sin. Genesis chapter 5 verse 3 tells us that we were born differently than Adam. Genesis 5 verse 3 says, "When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth." Adam's children were no longer in the likeness of God, but they were in his own likeness. That brings us to our first takeaway, which is all people are guilty from birth. We all start out with original sin that has been passed down like a disease, beginning with Adam and all the way to your parents, and then to you. But our sin goes even deeper than that. Romans 3 verse 23 says, "All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." 1 John 1 verse 8 tells us that we are lying if we claim to be without sin. James 2 verse 10 says, "Even one sin makes us guilty of breaking the whole law." So, we all do evil every day. The question is, where does that evil come from? Matthew chapter 15 verse 19 answers that for us. Here Matthew writes, For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, and slander. The sinful things that we do flow from the evil that exists in our hearts. That brings us to our second main point. All people are sinners who have separated themselves from God. In the garden, God gave this command to Adam and Eve. He said, "But you must not eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die." God gave Adam and Eve consequences if they ate from that. And that consequence was that they would surely die. Matthew chapter 25, verse 41 describes for us what judgment day will be like for the unbelievers. Here, Matthew writes, "Then he will say to those on his left, 'Depart from me, you who are accursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels.'" If Jesus hadn't died and lived as our substitute, we would have been sentenced to eternal suffering in hell. The consequence of our sin lasts eternally. There's no problem that's more serious than sin. It affects all people and brings us under eternal condemnation. Our final takeaway is because of our sin, we all have earned God's condemnation of eternal death. Our key passages for today are Romans chapter 5, verse 18, Romans chapter 3, verse 23, Isaiah 56, 3, and 2 Thessalonians 1, verse 9.